Well, good morning, good morning, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History. As you can see, today I am outdoors. My wife and I RV, and we've got company, so they've got the RV this morning, and very limited space. So I'm out in the dining tent, and hopefully you'll be able to see me. The sun comes out, gets pretty bright here, but onward and upward. Uh, we are continuing in our series, The Formation of the Deep State. And we've worked our way through several very important events, including the formation of corporations and the rise of corporations. And included in that is the passage of the uh, Ultra Vires Act. And remember now, ultra vires is that it stipulates that the corporate heads and all the folks involved in the corporation were to be about maximizing profits. They are not to be concerned about the public interest, and they are all insulated from any sort of liability, whether civil or criminal. And of course, that was personally and corporately. The corporations were immunized from civil assets being seized through a civil lawsuit by hiding their assets amongst different subsidiaries. And then they could hide their profits from the IRS by creating shell companies or holding companies. So every step along the way, it was the skids were greased for the corporation to be about the business of making money, public interest be damned, and not worry about any of the consequences. So inevitably, you're going to have a rise of a robber baron class, or some people call them captains of industry, depending on your perspective. I call them the formation of the deep state, because these are the 50, 60 men that are running all the corporations in the country, which means they're running the entire U.S. economy, which means they're running the U.S. government, because it's their campaign dollars they're putting these congressmen, senators, governors, presidents in office. So all they got to do is pull their strings. Uh, and so you see laws being written to favor these 50 or 60 corporate heads. You see cases being decided in courts to favor these corporate heads. Everything is being, it's all tilted in the direction of the corporations and the CEOs and the owners, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly things have swung, the capitalism has run amok, so to speak. And right on the heels of that, you see us meddling in the affairs of Hawaii. And you find out it's because some of these corporate heads see Hawaii as a perfect place to grow sugarcane. Queen Lily is infringing on that. So their proposal is to get rid of Queen Lily. So they go to their eunuchs, so to speak, in the government, and they say, hey, use the U.S. Marines as the hammer to go in and get rid of Queen Lily, which is exactly what the U.S. government did. We stole Hawaii from the Hawaiians and Queen Lily, and we put Sanford Dole in charge. He was the governor. Of course, he was the head of Dole Pineapple. Then we looked at Cuba and said, well, wouldn't it be nice if we do the same thing to Cuba we did to Hawaii? But the Cubans were smart. Even though they were in the midst of a revolution against the Philippines and we were offering to help them, they realized this is really a backdoor effort to steal Cuba like they did Hawaii. So though they accepted our help, they made us sign the Teller Amendment, which said that we could not annex Cuba like we did Hawaii when the war was over. The Filipinos did not demand such an amendment. So we did, essentially, because the Philippines were part of the Spanish colonial holdings. When the war was over, we stole the Philippines from the Filipinos after Spain surrendered to us. We got Guam and Wake Island, Puerto Rico, et cetera, et cetera. So we got some goodies out of that war. And it was all in an effort to A, get Cuba, even though we'd signed that amendment. You're going to see that we had loopholes. We're going to talk about that today. But more importantly, it was about getting the Philippines, because that gave us land to put a military base on in a part of the world that we didn't have a presence in. And our real goal in this imperialist push was to get access to raw materials. And what country had more raw materials than China, especially in Manchuria? And so that's why Teddy Roosevelt would force the peaceful solution of the Russo-Japanese War. They were fighting over Manchuria, and we wanted access to Manchuria. Another reason for the imperialist push was to get access to export markets. Well, who has more people to buy our goods than China? Especially if you add India in there. That part of the world has tons of potential with regard to export markets. And, you know, if you remember, we talked about all the different reasons for imperialism. It was those two. It was also the additional territory that we could add to our territory. It was also a land space that we could put military bases on and keep control of and monitor our growing empire. And social Darwinism had taught us that it was okay. These are just indigenous peoples. Remember, public interest doesn't matter anyway. And in this competitive world, there's the fit, there's the unfit. We're the fit. If we don't take these places, other countries will. So we're in a headlong dash to take these places. So the little splendid war, the Spanish-American War, was just that for us because very few people died on our side. It didn't cost a lot of money, it didn't take a lot of time. And out of it, we got access to all these different places, colonial holdings that used to belong to Spain, now they belong to us. And now we're about the business of managing that. And through winning that war, we now have access to an entrance into the Asian markets, the Asian territories through China and India, etc., which is going to be the real positive benefit, if you want to call it that, that comes out of the Spanish-American War. Cuba ends up being a sort of an afterthought. But what we want to look at today is, history builds. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. So all of these events have consequences, and they put us on a path. And eventually, this is going to lead us into two world wars. And then, as a result of that, those two world wars, those business owners, those 50 or 60 owners that were running the country, essentially from the outside looking in, are going to be invited into the government to run it from the inside. And that's when ultra vires gets really dangerous. That's the transition that we're working towards, where ultra vires, where it's all about profits, public interest doesn't matter, and everybody on the inside is insulated from any kind of liability. That private sector mindset is going to make it into the public sector as a result of the two world wars. We wouldn't get into the two world wars if the Spanish-American War doesn't happen first, if imperialism doesn't happen second. So you see how it's all building. And that's the other transition we're looking at is the one from when we cross the Rubicon from treachery into treason. Up into the Spanish-American War, these capitalists have run amok. These big business owners, these we call them deep staters today. They've run amok with treacherous activities, with their treacherous decisions, with their treacherous business models, et cetera, but they haven't committed treason. But the Spanish-American War, with its propagandizing of the American people, lying to the American people, manufacturing evidence such as a fake letter from the Spanish ambassador to gin up hostility and anger amongst the American people, and then ultimately using the government to conduct a false flag and sink their own ship, kill their own soldiers. That's how we got into the war. That's treason. We've betrayed the American people at this point. People have died. So a lot of thresholds have been crossed with the Spanish-American War. And then it's going to get, you do it the first time, it's a little tricky. You do it the second time, it's a little easier. You do it the third time, it's even easier. By the time you get to World War I and II, it's become a tried and true model. And then you get to the Cold War, it becomes business as usual. It is the standard operating procedure of the government now to lie to its people, to instigate wars and hostilities for the purposes of making money. expanding their empire, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly we wake up in 2025 and we wonder, as we start to learn the truth about some of these things, when and where did this all happen? How did this start? So that's what I'm trying to do, is build a case for these deep staters going all the way back to the end of the Civil War, the beginning of the rise of corporations, uh, how they wormed their way in and got control of the levers of power in our government and have been operating in the shadows ever since. We go to the ballot box every 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whichever, and we put in our people and we think we've done our job. Those are the folks in charge. Those are the ones we hold accountable. Turns out they're just Pinocchio, Geppetto behind the scenes pulling strings, and they're unelectable or unelected, completely unaccountable. All right, let's look at the fallout from the Spanish-American War. One of the colonies we got from Spain was Puerto Rico. And so instantly we're in this position. It's a new position for us where we have to deal with these new territories and stipulate what political rights these people are going, these indigenous peoples are going to have, uh, and what kind of territory it's going to be, et cetera, et cetera. So we start passing laws. We passed the Foraker Act, which gives us the right to appoint a governor and a legislature for Puerto Rico. So you can see we're sort of taking over. We're sent just like we did in the Philippines when we sent William Howard Taft there to be the governor. And we told through a series of cases called the insular cases that the Puerto Ricans had to pay U.S. taxes, but they weren't U.S. citizens. Wow, that's an interesting dynamic, right? Later, the Jones-Shaffer Act eased up a little bit on the Puerto Ricans, gave them partial U.S. citizenship rights, such as control over their own legislature. They can vote in U.S. primaries, which is true today, but they can't vote in U.S. Presidential or congressional elections. Just they're involved in the selection of the candidates essentially, but they don't have any say in who the final winner is. And because it's not considered state, still a territory, they receive no electoral votes. So if you're a territory of the United States and you have no electoral votes, the question is how much attention are any of the United States politicians going to pay to you? You don't matter. You matter in primaries, but you don't matter other than that. So, but it matters to us economically because Puerto Rico is a very important destination for a lot of vacationers, and it's become a sort of a retreat for a lot of American citizens. Um, and so that was how we handled Puerto Rico, sort of one of those lesser than territories. I guarantee you, if it was Cuba, we'd care more. You know, if you could grow sugar cane in Puerto Rico, it'd matter more. Cuba mattered, as we already have established. They forced us to sign the Teller Amendment before the war, which means we couldn't annex it. So we're bound by that. But when it came to being an independent country, we didn't want to be uh, completely independent either, because it is in our hemisphere, and we consider everything in the Western Hemisphere to be in our sphere of influence. So because of that, we told Cuba, we informed Cuba through the Platt Amendment that they were going to have to add some stipulations to their new constitution. Stipulation number one is they are not allowed to sign any treaties with any other nations without prior U.S. approval. Castro will come along later and test this when he signs a treaty with Khrushchev and the Soviets. And of course, this is an argument for our involvement in Cuba during Eisenhower and later during the Kennedy administration. We're also allowed to put a naval base on their territory. We call it Gitmo or Guantanamo. And we put in a clause that says we had the right to intervene in Cuba if necessary, if it concerned American interests. So basically, we're allowing Cuba to uh, write a constitution and form its own government, but we're going to be keeping tabs. We're the big brother to the north. It's going to be keeping tabs on everything they do, and we have veto authority. We can veto anything that they try to do if we don't approve. So they have to get our approval. They have to meet conditions that we've set up in advance. We can't annex them, and we didn't. But this is, and of course, what we're going to work towards is a business relationship with a puppet government. Basically, it's going to sort of come to it's going to be manifested in the 50s under the Batista regime, where he was basically our bought and paid for politician down there. And in exchange for bribes, he would allow us to basically turn Cuba into a wholly owned subsidiary of the United States government. And legitimate interests like mining companies and public utilities and public transportation and fruit companies and sugar cane pretty much dominated Cuba. It was all American owned. And then illegitimate interests like the mafia used Cuba as America's playground. It was Las Vegas before Las Vegas. You could fly 90 miles offshore. You were outside the jurisdiction of the United States Justice Department. You could gamble. There were houses of prostitution, hotels, resorts, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, Cuba, under the regime of our guy, Batista, became like an ATM machine for the United States during the 50s. And that was what the intention was. Though we never annexed Cuba, we basically put Cuba under our thumb. And when Castro came along, declared his independence and won the revolution over Batista and kicked all the Americans out, that's when we had all the problems suddenly with Cuba again. So essentially, we have succeeded in stealing now Hawaii and Cuba for the purposes of business, mainly sugar. And Hawaii, we've annexed and it'll later become a state. Cuba, we were limited from annexing. It will later become quite a headache for us as they swing back and forth between being our client state to being an independent state under the rule of somebody like Fidel Castro. But for a long time there, Cuba was a cash cow for us, which was the whole point at the beginning. So that's Cuba, but it didn't stop there. We've got a taste for this now, and we start, we're cultivating this new relationship with the Far East, and so we start reconstituting the old Northwest Passage argument again. If you go back in history, part of the reason why the United States was discovered in the first place, America was discovered in the first place, is because Europe was looking for a water route to Asia, China, India, for trade purposes. And you know the story. Columbus landed in the Bahamas. People had dark skin. He thought he was in China, and or India, which is why he called them Indians. And so later, when they discovered that this was a whole new world, then it became, well, we got to find a shortcut through this landmass to China and India to the east. And so a bunch of explorers came west looking for a water route through America. And they started way up in Canada. And that's how they found, Henry Hudson found the Hudson Bay up there, but it eventually stopped, right? It didn't go all the way through. And then other explorers worked their way down. It was a long trip, go all the way around the southern tip of South America. So everybody's looking for this water route. And of course, nobody ever found one. And so now here we are years later, and Teddy Roosevelt has discovered, and it's not unique to him, the French first tried this, that if you want to create a water route through North and South America, you go to the narrow strip that connects the two big continents. In Latin America, there, Panama had the most opportune location where you could, in combination with natural waterways that already exist there, you could dig a canal, connect all those, and you could connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. And there's your Northwest Passage, but it's man-made. And of course, from an engineering standpoint, it's a nightmare. The ocean levels are not the same. So you can't just dig a connector and flood, you'll empty one ocean and flood the other. So you've got to create a series of locks that raise the water level when you're going one direction, but lower the water when you're going the other direction, but keep it all contained. And of course, you're dealing with lowlands and mosquitoes and malaria. And yeah, it was just an engineering nightmare. Of course, the French gave up. That's what the French are good at. You know, you think about all the big projects or big events in the last 150 years, World War One, World War Two, Panama Canal. The French always get Vietnam. The French are involved at the beginning of all these things, but they always give up. And it gets hard, they give up. So the U.S. bought the Panama route from the French for $40 million. You should think about that. We bought all of Alaska for, what was it, 7 million or something? Maybe it was 11. I can't remember what it was. So this is a much more expensive. You know, real estate has gone up since then, and it's going to be really key to trade going forward. Also national security, but primarily trade. If you're one of these uh, corporate owners and you want this trade relationship with China to work, you want it to work in least expensive way or manner possible. And if you have to send ships all the way around South America all the time, and when you're going from the East Coast into the Pacific on their way to China, that's going to take a lot of time, a lot of fuel, and it's going to be very expensive. But if you could somehow cut that trip in half, that distance down by going through the Panama Canal, even with the Panama Canal fees that you have to pay, it's going to be much cheaper, much quicker. You make a lot more money. It's all about getting product from the East Coast, which is the Atlantic side, into the Pacific side on their way to Asia. And of course, also, we only had a one ocean navy at this time. So if you have a hot spot in the Atlantic, but your navy's in the Pacific, you got to go again all the way around the southern tip of South America to get to the Atlantic. And you probably get there too late. Same thing if the situation is reversed. And of course, we want our navy in the Pacific for obvious reasons. This is a new market, and we are competing with a lot of other countries for this same market. As long as we're in the vicinity, they're going to stay out of our way. But if we ever leave and go to the Atlantic, you know, you've heard the expression, while the cat's away, the mice will play. So we need to keep tabs on both uh, both oceans, so to speak. We only have a one ocean navy at that time, so we need a shortcut through it. So it's about money primarily, and we make a little side argument. It's about national security, but really that navy exists to protect our trade. That navy exists to protect our export markets. That navy exists so we can create and expand an empire. That's all about money. So we buy this Panama route, but the problem was Colombia at this time controlled Panama. Oh boy, here we go again. Remember, we wanted Cuba, but Spain controlled Cuba. So we instigate a conflict with Spain. Remember, we talked about that. And it was all fraudulent. And it led to the Spanish-American War. Now we control Cuba. So we're going to have to do something with Colombia, the same playbook to grease the skids again for us to get in there in Panama and dig this canal like we want to. And so we begin to negotiate. Teddy Roosevelt sends negotiators over to talk with Colombia about approving this canal project. And of course, Colombia sees opportunity in this, and they begin trying to extort money from the United States. Now, there are people, I always say this about the mafia, there are people you can double cross in this world. Mafia is not one of them. I always bring that up when we talk about the JFK assassination. There are people in this world, probably politicians in this world, you can extort. Teddy Roosevelt was not one of them. It was just not wired that way. And so it's like Teddy gave him a chance to do it the honest way. And then he said, okay, if this is how it's going to be, we're going to have to do it my way. So he offers Panama a bunch of money. He says, listen, if you'll instigate a rebellion against Colombia, we'll come in and help you. Just like Cuba in the Spanish all over again. Remember, Cuba was in a revolution. The Filipinos were in a revolution against Spain. And after we had sufficiently primed the pump, convinced the American people Spain was the bad guy, and now they're killing our naval officers, the USS Maine. We went in, took out Spain ostensibly to help the Cubans, to help the Filipinos. Really, it was about taking those places. So here we are again. We tell Panama, you rebel against Colombia, we'll come to your aid. We'll send the whole Navy, just like I sent the Great White Fleet to intimidate Japan. You remember that whole story when Teddy Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet to intimidate Japan after the Russo-Japanese War to keep Japan in its place. So to reassure China that we will be their defense against future Japanese aggression. Here he is using the Navy again. Remember, he used to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He understands how important the Navy, 70% of the world's surface is covered by water. So the country that has the strongest Navy is going to be able to reach all these places. And navies are very expensive to build all these ships, whatnot. So anyway, he sends the entire U.S. Navy to support this little rebellion in Panama. And Colombia now is forced to grant Panama its independence, which means now Colombia has no say in this project going forward. They got out over their skis, and now they're out. They don't get anything. He was offering them money to begin. Now they get nothing. It reminds me of that Michael Corleone scene in The Godfather where he's talking with another Godfather and they're demanding concessions from him. And they ask, do you understand? He says, I understand perfectly. Here's my ex. It was a U.S. politician who came and tried to extort him. And he basically told him, you'll get nothing from me. That's my answer. You'll get nothing. At the first, he was offering him a pretty handsome price. And then because they tried to extort him, he says, you'll get nothing. So that's Teddy Roosevelt. He's the mafioso in this situation. He tells Colombia, you'll get nothing. So now he's dealing with Panama. Of course, Panama is independent now. So they grant, by virtue of our Navy, so they grant us permission in exchange for about $10 million in an annual rent of 250 grand. So, it was a moneymaker for them. So the money that would have gone to Colombia now goes to Panama. We start digging this thing. And in the end, this canal cut about 8,000 nautical miles off the trip from the East Coast to the West Coast. So, and of course, it's not necessarily about getting from the East Coast to the West Coast. It's about getting all these products from the east side of the United States through the canal into the Pacific so they can go on to China. And then China can send their stuff through the canal back to the East Coast. That's what it's about. And not just China, but all those countries in India. I did a little research just to kind of, this is a little bit dated, but just to show you the economic impact of this canal. Now, in the turn of the century, December 31, 1999, we turned it back over to Panama. And of course, we still have dominion over. I mean, when Trump was running for president this last time, he actually made part of his campaign promise that we're going to take the Panama Canal back. And the reason he did that is because Panama was selling the rights to this canal bit by bit, piece by piece, to China. They were actually building an addition to it, another sort of like a second lane, so to speak. And China was doing all the work, and they were going to reap all the profits from it. Of course, that canal, in Trump's view, could not belong to China. And so he says, hey, this was him rattling his saber saying, if this continues and China ends up owning this thing, or it looks like they're going to own this thing, we're going to come in and take it back over. We dug the thing. It was ours, and we can take it back anytime we want. Since then, everything's changed. All the business in Panama along the canal route has changed. This was just, he never intended, I don't think, to take the canal back. But this was him rattling the saber, just like when he said Canada was going to be our 51st state. And we're going to buy Greenland. This is how he negotiates. And this is sort of the height of American imperialist thought process that, hey, the whole world, at first we were very isolationist. Then we get into this imperialist push, and then the Western Hemisphere becomes our sphere of influence. Now the whole world is under our sphere of influence. And anything that happens around the world, we have a say in it. That's where we are. The average toll in 1999, and this is just an average toll, is 54 grand. I always present this to my students, and they're like, holy cow, who would pay a toll of $54,000? Why would they pay it? It tells you how expensive it is, alternatively, to sail all around the southern tip of South America. They actually save money by paying this toll. The most expensive toll was about almost 400 grand. Yeah, it goes by the size, I guess, of the ship. And the yearly revenue that brought in was $2 billion. And now, because we've turned it over to Panama, that yearly revenue is going to Panama, which is why they're expanding it. This is a real moneymaker for us by virtue of our location, location. And of course, the Americans dug this thing. But this, going back, was an effort by Teddy Roosevelt to maintain a stranglehold on the Western Hemisphere and to establish our dominance there, but also to build this empire in the Far East. And in order to build this empire, we've got to be able to reach that empire. We've got to be accessible. It's got to be accessible. So you're seeing a transition from the old to the new, and it's all money related. And any decision that's money related, still to this day, but especially back then, was coming out of the offices of these big business owners, these big corporation owners who are whispering to their uh, politicians that they've bought or are renting in Washington, hey, we want the Philippines. We can put a base there so we can establish a relationship with China and India. So we dutifully did that. We need this canal so we can protect these new trade routes between us and the Far East. So Teddy's doing it. He's digging the canal, and so the old doctrine of telling Europe through the Monroe Doctrine, you stay out of our business, we'll stay out of yours, that's no longer applicable because Roosevelt has come along and added what he called a corollary, which is like an addendum. It's the new, out with the old, in with the new. Latin America is now considered part of the U.S. sphere of influence. And of course, and by extension, so is South America. Everything in the Western Hemisphere is in our sphere of influence. So now the Monroe Doctrine includes all of that as well. The Monroe Doctrine used to say, stay out of our business, which is the United States, the contiguous states. Right now, it includes Latin America and, by extension, South America as well. And to hammer that point home, Teddy Roosevelt paid all of Latin America's debts that it owed to Europe. They were in substantial debt, and so we paid their debt. Of course, you know how that works. When you play the part of Santa Claus, or you play the part of the what's that? Oh, I forget the term for it. The well, anyway, when you pay somebody's bills, now you have now they owe you, right? So we did them a favor. Now they didn't ask us to do it. We did it unsolicited because Europe was saying, well, hey, they owe us money. And so we said, well, we'll pay their debt. You leave them alone. That's our hemisphere. That's our jurisdiction now. So Europe was like, well, okay, as long as their debt is paid, I don't care who pays it. But if somebody pays their debt, then it's yours. And that's what we did. Uh, Latin Americans were not necessarily happy with the deal, though they're now out of debt because they realized, just like our offer to help Cuba and the Philippines in their revolutions against Spain came at a price. The price was they've lost their sovereignty to us. Now, us paying the debt of these Latin American countries and these South American countries to Europe, now it comes at a price. The price is they've lost their sovereignty to us. And we've already demonstrated that we can root around in local politics down there and get Panama to rebel against Colombia in exchange for our help so that we can dig a canal through Panama. I mean, we're pushing our weight around is what we're doing. We have become the Colossus of the North. And it's all about money. And we have, quickly here at the end, I just show you the three presidents that were in succession that are going to carry out this new imperialist goal of the United States, each in different ways. Like for Teddy Roosevelt, he used the Navy. We've seen it several times. He used it against Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. He used it to reassure China that Japan would no longer be a threat. He sent the Navy on a goodwill tour to intimidate the Japanese. Now he used it again against Colombia to get access to Panama so we could dig the canal. His favorite saying, everybody's familiar with, speak softly, carry a big stick, you'll go far. And in his view, the big stick was a strong military, specifically a navy. Then you get to William Howard Taft, and he believes instead of using military force, a softer power would be to use money. And so he began investing US dollars in all kinds of Latin American projects, building plantation, mines, oil wells. And this is all in an effort to help these big business owners that want to do business down there. Now they've got, in addition to investing their own money, they've got the US government investing its money in conjunction in these huge projects and treating Latin America like a colony of its own, that it can go in and get access to raw materials, it can get access to markets, it can get access to territories for military bases. I mean, it's all about money. So he's so you see, it's this. That's how we we sort of TR used same sort of a hybrid approach with Panama, right? He used the stick against Colombia, and he used the carrot with Panama to get access to build the Panama Canal. Taft was almost exclusively about money, using money to buy himself in. And then you get to Wilson, and Wilson was famous for his campaign against using military and money. He felt like that was morally wrong. And so, whereas Teddy Roosevelt used big stick diplomacy and Taft used dollar diplomacy, Wilson, on his high horse, said, I'm going to use moral diplomacy. And in his campaign for office said, we would never again seek one additional foot of territory or conquest. This is him trying to right the ship and restore America back to its isolationist past. Although he wasn't offering to give anything back, he's saying we're just not going to conquer anything else. We've achieved what we want to achieve. And from here on out, we're going to promote human rights, national integrity, opportunity, and all this nice sounding stuff. And he begins an outreach to the Latin American countries and to our friends and neighbors in the South, saying, we must prove ourselves Latin America's friends and champions upon terms of equality and honor. We must show ourselves friends by comprehending their interests, whether it squares with our own interest or not. Woodrow Wilson is interesting because here this is sort of a reversion to the mean, so to speak. We've always been an isolationist country. Wilson is offended by this imperialist direction we've been heading. And it appears the pendulum is going to swing back under Wilson's leadership. He's saying all the right things. Now, he's not offering to give back any of this additional territory that we've taken. We have succeeded in creating an empire controlling, in our sphere of influence, all of Latin America and South America. We've dug the canal. We've succeeded in taking from the Spanish, after the Spanish-American War, the Philippines, and exercising dominion over Cuba, and taking Puerto Rico and Guam and Wake Island. We now have a military base in Cuba. We now have a military base in the Philippines, and we have opened the door to trade and a relationship with China and India and the Far East, in Japan, and which is the biggest boondoggle of all. And now we've got this military, this Navy that TR has built up, and it's patrolling and going from ocean to ocean through the Panama, and we're surrounding Japan with these goodwill tours, and our Navy is ever present in everybody's backyard, and it's all about money. And that's when Wilson enters the scene. He says, "Oh, all right, we're not going to do that anymore. That's bad." And he criticizes Teddy for his use of force. He criticizes Taft for his use of money. And he says, we're going to treat everybody as equals, which violates the whole social Darwinist viewpoint in America, which is rife within the society. We saw it in the way the San Francisco paper talked about the Filipino people, treating them like nothing, like garbage, basically. And that's rife through our society. And Wilson's saying, no, we need to change and treat everybody as equals. So if the story ended there, you'd say, okay, Wilson was responsible for putting us back on the original path that the founding fathers saw, that George Washington uh, said was necessary. But it didn't end that way. In spite of his high sounding rhetoric, Wilson ends up, when push comes to shove, and this shows the power of the deep state. These politicians can run for office and say whatever the hell they want to say. It doesn't matter. When they get into office, they're going to play by our rules. We've seen that over and over and over again. Wilson runs for office on all this high sounding rhetoric. He gets elected. In other words, he taps into something the American people, the American electorate, that says, yes, we've gone too far. And so they vote him in. And now he wins by the hair of his chinny chin chin. It's basically because it's a 3-person race, and the Republican side gets split, Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. So he didn't even win a majority of the vote, but he wins. And so he wants to set us back, turn us back, the ship of state back in the direction of its isolationist past, and be live up to our ideals of all men are created equal, et cetera, et cetera. But as soon as he gets the reins of power, he's informed by his puppet masters, the Geppettos that run all these industries that have put us in this position. These Geppettos that pulled the strings to create the Spanish-American War, so that we could get those colonies. The Geppettos who pulled the strings, so we could get the Panama Canal. The Geppettos who pulled the strings to open trade into the Far East. They've been working hard. They've been opening up all these doors. They're getting access to raw materials. They're getting access to markets. They're getting access to territory. They're putting military bases everywhere. And now this guy comes along and says he's going to turn the clocks back. I don't think so. And so when he is presented with a couple instances of conflict, one on our border with Mexico, one in our sphere of influence with Haiti, he sends the military into Latin America on both occasions to settle the score. Now, he had run saying he wasn't going to do that, but he did. In Mexico, the situation was with Francisco Pancho Villa, the leader of a bunch of rebels in Mexico who, we were involved in this border dispute with Mexico. And again, it's all about territory. And there were some raids that had occurred. 18 Americans had died. So Wilson sends 10,000 troops down to the border to get him. And so this is military intervention. This is what he said TR should have never done. And now he's doing it. Now, eventually, World War I ends that effort, and we have to pull our troops out of Mexico and send them off fighting World War I. But we'll get to that in a second. But this shows that Wilson, despite his words, when it comes to his actions, he ended up copying what Teddy Roosevelt did. Teddy Roosevelt would have acted the same. In other words, he's following the Teddy Roosevelt playbook because somebody is pressuring him and saying, you have to handle this. You have to solve this to our benefit. This is our hemisphere. We call the shots. Mexico doesn't call the shots. Pancho Villa doesn't call the shots. We call the shots. So send the military down. And it's, so the irony here, the ultimate irony, as he's doing all this talking about friendship, understanding, as he's running for office, he's criticizing Teddy Roosevelt for using big stick diplomacy. He's criticizing Taft for using money. He's promising a new day of moral diplomacy. And he even runs a campaign. World War I, it wasn't World War I yet, but it was a European war, and both sides were trying to get the United States in on their side. And he runs his campaign saying, as long as I'm president, we'll never be involved in this war. He even used buttons. He kept us out of war. And that's when he ran for re-election. He kept us out of war. And so there is a juxtaposition between Wilson's words and Wilson's actions, because ultimately it was Wilson who was president when we declared war and went to fight in Europe in World War I. So the ultimate irony here is that Wilson and his words were very isolationist and he was on this moral crusade to return the United States to a period, into a time when we didn't push our weight around. But then when push came to shove, he sent our troops down to Mexico. He sent troops to Haiti. And then he also sent troops into, he put us in the First World War. So the irony is so rich. Teddy Roosevelt threatened to use troops in the Navy against Colombia, never had to. Threatened Japan with the Navy, but never had to. Teddy was a walking embodiment of his expression, walk softly, carry a big stick. He didn't necessarily have to uh, uh, do what he threatened to do because people were so intimidated and thought he would, so they quickly bowed to his demands. Taft never used the military in that way. He bought everybody off. He was, but Wilson promised to use words, to use negotiation, to treat everybody the same as an equal partner. But in the end, he had to send troops into 3 different locations, one of which was the mother of them all, World War One. So I think that's instructive when it comes to understanding who's really in charge in America. It doesn't matter what these candidates, when they run for office, what they say. It matters what they do when they get into office. Oftentimes, they violate their own campaign promises because when they get into office, they are informed by these shadowy characters who are running the country. No, we have investments, we have interests around the world, and you are not going to be the one who stops that progress. You're not going to be the one that kicks that away. You're not going to be the one that comes along and stops what we started 100 years ago or whatever. And so these shadowy characters, these unelected, these unaccountable characters get these public characters who are on the record with what they are going to do. They get them to change their mind and violate their own principles. That's what happened with Woodrow Wilson. He ends up having to violate his own principles in order to keep a handle on this new empire that he inherited. It becomes like the tail wagging the dog. You don't really have a choice now. You get into this office of the president, you've inherited this big empire. You don't like the fact that we have this empire. You don't like the way we got the empire. You certainly don't want to add to the empire, but you have to maintain the empire. And so otherwise you'd be impeached for treason, right? So you violate your own principles and you go to war time and time again to maintain this empire. And that's the story of empire. No one wants to be part of your empire. No one wants to be under somebody else's thumb. So they're always rising up. You always have trouble spots. There's competitions for empire that run into each other. And eventually you have to use the ultimate hammer, the military. When you're president, you're the commander in chief. You have to make that call. And so Woodrow Wilson comes into office saying, I will never do that. But before he leaves office, he does it 3 different times. His hands are tied. That's the unaccountable, unelected power behind the throne that has set in motion something 150 years, for the last 150 years or so, that now every president who comes along, their hands are tied and they are bound by these previous agreements, these previous actions that have just built one upon another this foundation of this huge empire. And now they find they're not as free as they thought they were to do what they thought promised that they would do. It's this deep state that's pushing these presidents to make these decisions, violate their own principles. So, all right, that is feeding us right into the next big event, which is going to be World War One. And what I hope to show as we get into World War One is how history builds and how the decisions that these bosses have made, these deep staters have made, these have long, far-reaching consequences that eventually spill us into World War One. And then when World War One is over and an accounting is made, we see just how much money these folks made as a result of fighting in this war. And you start to realize that war is profitable. And now we have a new way to make money, not just on accumulation of empire and trade routes and markets and raw materials. Now you can make money off war. And it's these same people that own all these corporations, that build all these products, that make the money, that sell to the War Department, whatever, make all this money. And now they have a new business model. So we'll get into that next. Thank you for joining. Subscribe to my channel. Feel free to share. Feel free to comment. Feel free to smash the like button. Until next time, God bless. Thank you.